Welcome to This Week in Business Risk, a podcast by Mission Gray, the leading provider of external intelligence for corporate decision making. I'm your host, Rwizi Rweizooba Ainomugisha, a proud Mission Gray Guild member and founder of the Wargaming Weekly newsletter. Today's episode is a solo briefing. Just me walking you through the geopolitical and business risk signals that mattered most this past week. So let's get into it. Are you ready to get risky? Well, you better be, because this past week has witnessed a convergence of four major foreign policy and regulatory moves that collectively redraw the global investment landscape across critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, trade corridors, and AI ecosystems. Washington put more than $3 billion behind a plan to break China's grip on the minerals that run everything from fighter jets to solar panels. India passed a law that just took mining taxation out of the hands of its own states. India also opened trade talks with 5 countries at the southern tip of Africa. And finally, the State Department sent a letter telling 35 countries that they have to pick a side in the AI race. Each of these developments offers concrete first mover advantages for investors, logistical operators, mining companies, and manufacturers. But at the same time, carries significant execution risks for those who enter haphazardly, without foresight, without planning, without a clear risk strategy. So in today's episode of This Week in Business Risk, I'm going to walk you through each of these 4 foreign policy moves, exploring what exactly happened, which industries stand to gain, and how exactly you should be moving if your company is operating in one of these industries. No fluff, no vague recommendations. I'm talking clear, actionable insights that you can actually act upon immediately, all courtesy of Mission Gray's powerful software. Let's dive in. Foreign policy move number 1, the US critical minerals and defense supply chain overhaul. Quick disclaimer here, if we're being completely accurate, this move didn't necessarily happen this past week. It has been unfolding since last month, but is still very relevant today. Between July 20th and August 7th, the Trump administration signed 4 interconnected executive actions that collectively wrapped in an over $3 billion package represent the most aggressive critical minerals policy shift in US history. I'll keep this concrete because the details matter for anyone in this space. 1. Aluminum tariffs. They've been sitting at 50%. Under the new proclamation, any company that commits to building a domestic smelter gets that cut in half, down to 25%. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. You need to break ground by January 20th, 2029. 2. Polysilicon, the raw material behind solar panels and chips. There's now a price floor, $21 per kilogram for raw polysilicon, 38 cents per watt for finished solar modules, plus a 15% tariff on top. That's a floor designed to stop Chinese producers from just undercutting American manufacturers into bankruptcy, which let's be honest, is exactly the playbook China has run before. 3. Export controls using the Defense Production Act on recoverable critical minerals. Things like battery black mass, which is basically the valuable sludge left over when you recycle a lithium battery, and rare earth scrap. Washington wants that material staying in the country, not getting shipped out for reprocessing. And 4, this is the one with teeth, an executive order ending the waivers that let defense contractors source rare earth magnets, tungsten, tantalum, and molybdenum from China, Russia, North Korea, or Iran. That waiver dies January 1st, 2027. After that date, if you're a defense contractor still sourcing from those 4 countries, you are, by definition, out of compliance. Now, on top of the policy architecture, there was actual money on the table. On that August 7th State Department roundtable, the administration announced over $2 billion in direct project investments. $1.4 billion to a company called Sila Nanotechnologies for silicon carbon battery anodes. $400 million to Sunrise Energy Metals for a scandium mine in Australia, notably not even domestic soil, which tells you this is about allied supply chains, not just American soil. $150 million to Neuron Magnetics, who are working on rare earth-free permanent magnets, which, if that technology matures, is genuinely a big deal because it sidesteps the whole rare earth dependency problem. And $85 million to Standard Bauxite for refractory grade bauxite. There's also a workforce angle here that I think gets underplayed. $180 million is going into a mining education program called Prospect, which stands for Providing Opportunities for Specialized Education in Critical Technologies. This is the US Department of Energy's program aimed at supporting the development of American talent that can discover, produce, process, and advance the critical minerals supply chains that are essential to America's energy security. This $180 million funding is part of the Trump administration's efforts to double the number of graduates coming out of the 14 accredited mining schools in the country within 2 years. Why does that matter? Because the Society for Mining, Metallurgy and Exploration estimates that over 221,000 mining workers, that's more than half the entire current workforce, are set to retire by 2029. And yet, mining engineering enrollment has collapsed from about 1,500 students 8 years ago to under 600 as of 2023. So you can throw all the capital you want at reshoring critical minerals production, but if there's nobody trained to run the smelter, the capital doesn't help you. So who actually benefits from this if you're listening as an operator or an investor? Mission Gray has identified the following 4 candidates for first mover advantage. 1, mining services and mineral processing firms, especially anyone touching graphite, tantalum, niobium, boron, or scandium. You have a real window right now to lock in offtake agreements before that January 2027 waiver deadline forces every defense contractor in the country into panic procurement at the same time. 2, aluminum smelter developers and their equipment suppliers should be looking at site acquisition today, not in 2028, because that construction start deadline in January 2029 is closer than it feels. 3, battery recycling and black mass processors benefit structurally from the export controls. Lee Cycle and Redwood Materials are the big names already positioned, but there's real room for smaller entrants who can claim the right geography. And 4, solar manufacturers building US facilities can actually negotiate company-specific deals with the Commerce Department for tariff-free equipment imports during construction, which is a meaningful capital cost reduction if you know to ask for it. But how could this first mover advantage go wrong? Well, the primary risk is China's proven willingness to flood markets in order to crush Western rivals. China has a proven playbook of flooding markets to crush Western competitors right when they're about to reach scale. Beijing could lift restrictions on scandium or rare earths at exactly the moment a Western project hits production and collapse the price out from under it. New mine construction in the US takes an average of 29 years from discovery to production. Think about that timeline against a political cycle. Processing, specifically, requires decades of accumulated technical expertise that frankly doesn't exist at scale outside China right now. They hold close to 90% of global rare earth refining capacity. And there's already litigation in this space. MP Materials and US Rare Earth are locked in an intellectual property dispute over permanent magnet technology. That's a preview of what happens when a lot of capital chases a narrow set of processes at once. So if you're a player in any of these industries with first mover advantage, how should you be timing your move? Mission Gray recommends a phased commitment. Right now, through the end of this year, get letters of intent in motion with the Department of War's Title III office or under the Defense Production Act framework and start environmental permitting now, because that clock doesn't stop for anyone. Early next year, as those waivers expire, that's your moment to lock supply contracts at premium pricing, because defense primes will be scrambling. And 2027 through 2029, that's your construction window under the tariff relief terms, with the Linus deal worth $96 million as a template for negotiating price floor guarantees before you commit real capital. Now let's go to India, because India just made a very similar move for very similar reasons, using a very different tool, tax law. Foreign policy move number 2, India's Mines and Minerals Amendment Bill 2026. On August 12th and 13th, the Indian Parliament passed something called the Mines and Minerals Amendment Bill 2026. And I want to explain why this is a bigger deal than it sounds, because on paper, it's a tax bill. Here's what it actually does. It centralizes mineral taxation for coal, lignite, iron ore, graphite, cobalt, lithium, nickel at the federal level. States can no longer levy their own independent taxes or fees on mining land and mining operations. It also sets up a new coal and minerals exchange expected to launch within 8 or 9 months, and it applies across 11 mineral-rich states. Why now? Well, in 2024, India's Supreme Court actually ruled the other way. It empowered states to tax minerals independently. This bill is New Delhi's parliamentary answer to that ruling, effectively neutralizing it. And the economic logic is straightforward once you see the numbers. Mining contributes roughly 2% of India's GDP right now. Compare that to Australia, South Africa, or Canada, countries with broadly similar mineral wealth, where mining runs 8 to 10% of GDP. India is sitting on the resources, but not capturing anywhere near the same value. And New Delhi's read is that fragmented state-level taxation is a big part of why. Some of the state-level numbers actually show how much is at stake locally. Odisha alone is projecting mining revenue of about 560 billion rupees for the coming fiscal year. That's roughly 6.7 billion US dollars, which would make up nearly 80% of the state's entire non-tax revenue. Jharkhand holds about 40% of India's total minerals. And here's a telling trend. State's share of overall mineral revenue has actually already risen from 65 to 88% between 2015 and 2025, even before this bill. So states have gotten used to a growing slice of this pie, which is exactly why this legislation is landing as a political fight, not just a technical adjustment. More on that in a second. There's also a foreign investment angle running in parallel. India pulled in $94 billion in gross FDI this fiscal year, up over 17% year on year, though net FDI was a much more modest $7.7 billion, which tells you a lot of capital is flowing in and back out. To smooth that friction, India is pushing what it calls BIT 4.0, a new bilateral investment treaty framework aiming to finalize treaties with the EU, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, Oman, and the Maldives within 2 to 3 months. One meaningful change in that framework is that it cuts the quote-unquote domestic remedy requirement, basically how long a foreign investor has to fight through India's own courts before they can go to international arbitration, from 5 years down to as little as 2. So who wins here? Mission Gray has identified the following 4 candidates for first mover advantage. 1. Coal and thermal power equipment manufacturers first, because that new coal exchange is going to demand faster, more standardized block auctions. 2. Lithium, cobalt, and nickel exploration companies get a genuinely more predictable tax environment across all 11 states, which should compress the risk discount investors have historically applied to Indian mineral projects. 3. Mining technology and automation firms. That's robotics, autonomous vehicles, AI-assisted exploration. All these now have an opening because production speed is now the government's explicit priority over tax maximization. And 4. Infrastructure and logistics companies serving the mining corridors in Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Rajasthan should see real volume growth as blocks come online faster under one unified federal rulebook instead of 11 different ones. But how could this first mover advantage go wrong? Well, naturally, India's federal structure is not going to just roll over on this. Jharkhand's chief minister has already called this a quote-unquote black bill and threatened what he described as massive agitation across every district, every block, every panchayat in the state. Kerala has separately objected, framing it as federal overreach. So even though the central government has clear constitutional authority here, state-level implementation delays, protests, and court challenges could genuinely slow down auctions and permitting on the ground. And despite the BIT 4.0 reforms that I just mentioned, taxation disputes specifically remain excluded from international arbitration protection. So resource nationalism risk hasn't actually gone away, it's just been repackaged. Land acquisition is still slow as well. Tribal and environmental clearances alone typically add 3 to 5 years to a project timeline in India, and this bill doesn't touch that. So if you're a player in any of these industries with first mover advantage, how should you be timing your move? Mission Gray recommends that if you're moving on this, the near-term play, that's August through October, is to engage directly with India's Ministry of Mines to pre-register ahead of the new block auctions and keep an eye on that BIT 4.0 cabinet decision, which is expected imminently and will matter a lot if you're structuring investment through the EU, Saudi Arabia, or Switzerland. Medium term, into the first quarter of 2027, position yourself for that first coal exchange launch. And on a broader strategic level, don't go at it alone. Enter through joint ventures with domestic Indian partners who already know how to navigate land acquisition and state relationships, and lean on the District Mineral Foundation framework for community engagement, since 96% of mining revenue already flows to states through existing levies. That relationship infrastructure already exists. You don't need to build it from scratch. India wasn't just moving on minerals this week. It also opened a trade door that has been closed for over 2 decades. Let's go there next. Foreign policy move number 3, the preferential trade agreement between India and the Southern African Customs Union. On August 12th, India signed what's called Terms of Reference with SACU, short for the Southern African Customs Union. That's South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. 5 countries, 1 customs block. This is the formal start of negotiations towards a preferential trade agreement. I want to flag something that might get lost in the acronyms. This is India's first trade agreement terms signed with an entire African regional bloc. And it's a revival of talks between India and this exact bloc that collapsed once already back between 2002 and 2010. So this has been unfinished business for over 20 years. The negotiations will cover 8 separate chapters: goods, rules of origin, customs procedures, trade remedies, food safety standards, technical barriers, dispute resolution, legal provisions. That's the full architecture of a real trade deal, not a symbolic gesture. And it's not happening in isolation. India is simultaneously pursuing similar preferential trade deals with the South American trade bloc Mercosur, with Mexico, with Kenya, and with Chile. India's exports overall are up 15% year on year for April through July of this fiscal year. And the government's public target is $1 trillion in combined goods and services exports for the year. Let's look at the actual trade numbers with SACU specifically, because there's urgency baked into this. India exported $7.5 billion in goods to SACU last fiscal year and imported $9.2 billion. So India is actually running a trade deficit there, which it wants to narrow. South Africa alone accounts for $7 billion of those exports and $8.5 billion of the imports. And here's the number that explains the timing. Autos and auto parts were India's second largest export category to SACU at $1.7 billion. And South Africa is currently considering raising import duties on vehicles from India and China from 25% all the way up to 50%. If that goes through before this preferential trade agreement is finalized, Indian automakers get hit hard. If the agreement locks in concessions first, they are protected. So there's a real race against the clock. On the flip side, India is explicitly seeking preferential access to SACU's critical minerals. That's platinum group metals, manganese, and copper. The exact inputs you need for batteries and clean energy manufacturing. So this deal isn't one directional. It's India trading market access for mineral access, which, if that sounds familiar, is basically the same logic driving every other story in this episode. So, who benefits first? Mission Gray has identified the following four candidates for first mover advantage. 1. Indian automakers and their tier 1 suppliers. That's Tata Motors, Mahindra, Bajaj Auto. All these have a genuinely defensive reason to want this deal to go through as fast as possible, given that there's a looming tariff threat from South Africa. 2. Pharmaceutical companies exporting generic medicines get a real opening as well, since affordable medicines access is an explicit part of India's pitch to the bloc. 3. Engineering goods and industrial machinery exporters can look forward to capital equipment duty reductions. And 4, mining and mineral trading firms sourcing platinum group metals or manganese can start securing preferential supply arrangements now ahead of competitors who are still buying on the spot market. There's also a second order effect worth naming here. This corridor is going to spike demand for shipping and port infrastructure along the Indian Ocean route connecting Mumbai and Chennai to Durban and Cape Town. So if you're in logistics, that's a lane to watch. And zooming out even further, India is running parallel trade talks with African trade bloc SACU, South American trade bloc Mercosur, as well as individual countries, Kenya and Chile. So this is starting to look like a parallel trade architecture running right alongside China's Belt and Road adjacent commercial relationships. So if you set up manufacturing in India, you're increasingly buying access to Africa, Latin America, and South Asia through a single production base. But how could this first mover advantage go wrong? The risk, honestly, is history repeating itself. These exact same structural tensions killed the last round of talks between 2002 and 2010. SACCO's smaller, less developed members, particularly Lesotho and Eswatini, are going to push hard for development protections that could limit what products actually get covered. And South Africa's own auto tariff ambitions could harden its negotiating position before the preferential trade agreement terms are even finalized. So, if you're a player in any of these industries with first mover advantage, how should you be timing your move? Mission Gray recommends that if you're a manufacturer thinking about this corridor, start building your distribution networks and after sales infrastructure in the SACU region right now before the tariff concessions are locked in. Get the channel partnerships and brand presence established while the window is still open. And watch for India's Commerce Secretary, who's expected in Chile by the end of August or in September. That trip signals India may be trying to close several of these preferential trade agreements at once, which would be your cue that a genuine multi-market export platform built from an Indian base is coming together faster than people expect. Okay, 3 stories down, all of them in one way or another about resources and access. Now we get to the story that ties everything else together. This is the big one. Foreign policy move number 4, the US Pax Silica ultimatum. On August 14th, Reuters reported on a leaked State Department draft letter. It's addressed to the 35 signatory countries of what's called the June 2026 quote-unquote AI opportunity statement. And it tells them to choose formally, explicitly, between 2 competing blocks. One line from that letter really stuck with me because I think it tells you everything about the moment we're in. Quote, to be part of everything is to be part of nothing, unquote. That's not diplomatic hedging. That's an ultimatum put in writing from the US State Department to 35 countries. Let me back up and explain the 2 sides of this. On one side, there's Pax Silica, launched back in December of last year by Undersecretary of State Jacob Helberg. It now has roughly 24 member nations, including Japan, Australia, South Korea, the EU, India, the UAE, Kazakhstan, and the Netherlands, which matters enormously. I'll explain why in a second. Members get access to shared co-investment in AI infrastructure projects, coordinated export controls, and a defined position in the semiconductor supply chain. On the other side, there's WACO, short for the World Artificial Intelligence Cooperation Organization, China's answer, founded on July 16th, with 29 member nations, including Russia, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Belarus. Now, why does the Netherlands matter so much? Because a single Dutch company, ASML, makes the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, EUV for short, that are required to manufacture the most advanced computer chips on Earth. Nobody else makes them. Not one other company anywhere at that level. So the Netherlands being a Pax Silica founding member is not a coincidence. It's the whole point. And Taiwan, also aligned with Pax Silica, produces 41% of all processor chips globally and over 90% of the most advanced ones. So when you add it up, the two most important physical choke points in the entire global chip supply chain, the machine that makes the chips and the country that fabricates them, both sit inside the American-led bloc. That's the leverage behind this letter. It's not a bluff. But China is not standing still either. Its core domestic market crossed 1.2 trillion yuan last year, roughly $176 billion, spread across more than 6,200 AI enterprises. Chinese open source AI models have racked up over 10 billion downloads globally, and Chinese open weight models now account for 41% of all downloads on Hugging Face, which, if you're not familiar, is basically the central library that AI developers worldwide pull models from. So this isn't a story about one side being technologically dominant and the other scrambling to catch up. Both blocks have real substantial leverage. That's exactly why the ultimatum is being sent now, before the balance tips definitively either way. And you can already see the ground level moves happening. The Philippines has signed a deal for a 1,619 hectare special economic zone under Pax Silica, specifically for semiconductor assembly infrastructure. Panama is building an AI supply chain credentialing platform tied to the Panama Canal, positioning the canal itself as a piece of trusted, verified infrastructure within the American bloc. And then there's Kazakhstan, sitting on substantial tungsten, copper, and rare earth reserves, which right now is the only country confirmed as a member of both Pax Silica and Waco simultaneously. I want to sit on Kazakhstan for a second because I think it's the most important data point in this whole story. Kazakhstan is trying to hedge, stay useful to both sides, keep options open. Historically, in trade and diplomacy, that's called prudent diversification. It's what risk managers are trained to do. But under this new ultimatum, that exact same behavior is starting to look less like diversification and more like strategic unreliability in the eyes of whichever bloc you're trying to stay close to. So Kazakhstan is the test case for whether hedging is still a viable strategy in this new environment. And I don't think anyone actually knows the answer yet, which is exactly why it's worth watching closely over the next few months. So, who benefits from picking a lane early? Mission Gray has identified the following 4 candidates for first mover advantage. 1, semiconductor assembly, testing, and packaging firms, what the industry calls OSAT. These have a real opening to position inside Pax Silica states right now. That's the Philippines, India, and the UAE, who are all actively building capacity under this exact framework. 2, Critical minerals companies operating in Pax Silica aligned nations such as Australia, Canada, Argentina, Chile, Kazakhstan, with that one obvious caveat, get preferential access to the American AI investment pipeline. 3. AI infrastructure builders, that's data centers, industrial cooling, power generation, should be targeting Pax Silica member states specifically, since that's where coordinated investment is actually flowing. And 4, logistics firms who specialize in high security supply chains for semiconductors and rare minerals are going to see rising demand because Pax Silica increasingly requires provenance verification, proof of where materials actually came from at every step. But how could this first mover advantage go wrong? The risk of not committing is real, and it's structural, not just political. Advanced AI accelerator chips degrade and need replacement every few years, which means whatever block controls chip access effectively gets to keep reinforcing its own rules indefinitely. There's no getting grandfathered out of it. A company that leans toward Waco-aligned nations risks losing access to ASML equipment, to TSMC fabrication capacity, and to American AI accelerator chips, which right now is the foundational layer underneath all frontier AI development. But committing exclusively to Pax Silica has its own real cost. Forfeiting access to China's enormous domestic AI market, those 6,200 plus enterprises, and Chinese mineral supply, at least through whatever transition period this ends up taking. So, if you're a player in any of these industries with first mover advantage, how should you be timing your move? Mission Gray recommends a phased approach once again. Between now and September, before the expected Trump-Xi summit, and before Pax Silica enforcement likely gets formalized, audit your own supply chain for dual block exposure. If you're dependent on Chinese mineral processing anywhere in that chain, start qualifying alternative sources in Pax Silica aligned countries now, while you still have the runway to do it deliberately instead of in a panic. Heading into the fourth quarter, engage directly with the State Department's investment coordination mechanisms. The Philippines' New Clark City project and that Panama Canal credentialing platform are both near-term, concrete entry points, not abstract future opportunities. And if you're a services company rather than a manufacturer, there's a real growing market forming around AI-grade mineral verification, supply chain traceability, and export control compliance, because every country in both blocks is going to need to prove its alignment continuously, not just declare it once. That's Pax Silica. Now, as I wrap up this brief, let's zoom all the way out, because I promised you a thesis and here it is. Every single one of these moves, the US minerals package, India's mining reform, the India Circle trade opening, and the Pax Silica ultimatum, shares the exact same underlying logic. The global economy is fracturing into supply chain blocks, organized around security, not around cost efficiency. For most of my working life, and probably most of yours, the operating assumption in business was simple. Find the lowest cost, most efficient supplier, wherever they happen to sit on the map. That assumption is breaking down in real time in front of us this week. What's replacing it is a world where access to resources, to processing capacity, to logistics corridors gets allocated according to political alignment, not market price. And if that's true, then the strategic implication for anyone running a business with international exposure is genuinely uncomfortable. First mover advantage no longer just goes to whoever's fastest or cheapest into a market. It goes to whoever most credibly commits to one block supply chain architecture and sticks to it. Which brings me back to Kazakhstan, because I think it's the cleanest illustration of the entire episode. Hedging between blocks, for decades, that was just called prudent diversification. And it was what any sensible risk manager would tell you to do. Today, that same behavior is increasingly read as strategic unreliability by the very partners you're trying to hedge between. That's a genuine inversion of how corporate risk strategy has worked for most of the post-Cold War era. I don't think most companies have caught up to that shift yet. I think most companies are still operating on the old assumption. And the window for positioning around all this is narrower than people realize. The defense waiver deadline hits January 1st, 2027. India's BIT cabinet decision is expected imminently. The Indian coal exchange launches within 9 months, and Pax Silica enforcement is likely to get formalized sometime around that expected Trump-Xi summit next month. Those aren't soft, flexible dates. Those are hard deadlines. And they're going to determine market access for years, not months, for whoever is paying attention right now this week versus whoever catches up to this story in 6 months once it's already conventional wisdom. That's the convergence signal. 4 stories, one map being redrawn. Thank you for listening. This has been episode 3 of This Week in Business Risk, a podcast by Mission Gray, the leading provider of external intelligence for corporate decision making. With Mission Gray, you can see external changes early, test decisions under real-world scenarios, and most importantly, act before your competitors. If your company is operating in shipping, aviation, manufacturing, mining, banking, insurance, investment, real estate, wealth and asset management, Mission Gray is the only tool you need to understand what is happening outside your company and what it means for your decisions. So, are you a risk manager or strategy officer looking to make faster decisions under uncertainty or identify risks and opportunities earlier? Book your demo today at missiongray.com to see how our cutting-edge AI-powered software can help you turn risk management into competitive advantage. After you're satisfied with the demo, you can use Stripe code Rwizi to get a monthly $100 discount on your Mission Gray subscription. That's RWIZI, Rwizi, for a monthly $100 discount on your Mission Gray subscription at missiongray.com. Thank you once again for listening. Until next time, I remain yours in risk, Rwizi.